So good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this joint Science Europe UK Research and Innovation webinar, empowering policymakers with informed scientific knowledge to address the climate crisis. What can we learn from the COVID-19 response? Science Europe is an association of 38 member organisations of both research funding and research performing organisations from 28 countries across Europe. And Science Europe works very closely with its membership base, its national governments, scientific community, policymakers, and the general public to promote collaboration, research excellence throughout Europe and globally. Myself, Melanie Welham, Executive Chair of BBSRC, is a member of the Science Europe Governing Board, and so I'm delighted that we're able to work in collaboration and partnership with Science Europe on this webinar today. Really, Science Europe works as a policy platform for its members. It really harnesses the extensive experience and knowledge of those members in science policy issues, and really focuses in two main sort of areas: how to enhance the opportunities for collaboration between national public research organisations, so both funders and performers, and contributing to the continuous development of research policy in Europe. So the aim of today's Empowering Policymakers webinar is really to demonstrate the value of that international collaboration and the rapid evidence-based policy action and how important that is in addressing the climate crisis. We hope to sort of focus and highlight three main areas today. The first, the importance of working at local, regional, national and international levels and with expertise across all of those levels. The need to increase global cooperation between the research community and policymakers. This is happening, but there are opportunities to improve this continually. And also to consider how research and innovation can really most effectively inform policy that can lead to action on climate change. So this webinar builds on a pre-COP26 webinar that UK Research Innovation, Science Europe, along with the Spanish National Research Council and the Swedish Research Council for International Development, or FORMAS, held at the beginning of September, which was focusing on science for the green transition. At this previous pre-COP workshop, we had an exchange of ideas from Science Europe members and high-level experts in science policy for addressing climate change and discussed three main objectives. How can we actually strengthen the role for European funders and researchers in the green transition? How can we enhance the dialogue and collaboration between performers and funders, because that will underpin progress? And how can organisations like Science Europe, which represents a broad body of members across 28 countries, as I said, really provide advocacy on behalf of European research organisations to help accelerate that green transition? There are a number of outcomes from this workshop. I think we all recognise here what a pressing concern action on climate change actually is, and business as usual isn't possible. We really, really need to move forward now before it's irreversible. Research organisations and funders in particular can incentivise our researchers and reward them for engaging in science communication and in that public debate. We already do that, and we have examples here, but I think there's further opportunities to do that. Looking at how we can strengthen and build further collaborations between funders and researchers across countries is really important as well. The workshop also considered what some of the barriers can actually be in this area. And I think one of those that was identified, which I think will be interesting to discuss today, is how can we more effectively exchange information between science and policy? How can we kind of elevate really the communication to the public and that engagement? And how can we overcome some of the limitations that there are in career systems that can perhaps prevent people from taking forward some of these actions? Obviously, in thinking about what some of the barriers were, thinking about what some of the solutions might be. And some of those were about how can we really embed kind of the circular feedback and discussion and dialogue between researchers and policymakers? How can we have more effective communication with the civil society, between science and the civil society. I think COP and events such as this are a great opportunity to do that, but we need to keep that momentum going forward. And one idea was how we can really engage with early career researchers in terms of policy making and also research communication. They are the future leaders, and so I think if they can take forward these actions, that would be really powerful. I'm really pleased that the report from this workshop, Science for a Green Transition, is published today, and we shall be sharing the link for that report in the chat function. The webinar this morning sort of builds on the outcomes from this previous workshop and will really add value to that discussion and will really help to focus and set out what the priority actions are for Science Europe going forward. So earlier in the year, Science Europe published its new strategic plan, and one of the 3 priorities in that plan was strengthening the role and contribution of science to tackling global challenges. I don't think there's any greater global challenge than climate change, so I think this is really, really timely to have this debate today. And I think Science Europe can really play an important role as a vehicle for fostering coordination across European levels, because it plays that role as a convener of both funders and performing organisations. It can bring together and share best practice. You know, we all have our own experiences, but sharing those, we can be much stronger in that. And I think with that, it can then sort of bring together those thoughts and really advocate at the policy level, both in Europe, but also internationally. I think what I'm describing, you could probably say, is Science Europe as a knowledge broker, actually. And, you know, we can provide the scientific evidence and knowledge that they can then take forward as evidence at supranational levels in an accessible way that policymakers can access and take forward to their decision makers and other fora. And in that way, help really move and drive change. We all are aware, and I don't need to say this to any of you, either the panel or those who have joined us for the webinar, that international collaboration is absolutely vital in this particular area. And I think it's going to be important as we move forward to really find solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. I hope you have a really interesting panel discussion and debate this morning. I am sure you will, with the array of speakers who have very kindly joined us. And I look forward to hearing about the discussion through my role on the governing board of Science Europe. At this point, I'd like to hand over to the chair for the webinar, Professor Dame Jane Francis, who is the director of the British Antarctic Survey, which is a research centre supported by the Natural Environment Research Council, also part of UK Research Innovation. Over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And thank you for highlighting sort of 2 really important questions. I think it's about international collaboration and about how science and research and policy can be a little bit more joined up, as we've done successfully in COVID. So can we do this for climate change? As Melody said, I'm director of the British Antarctic Survey, and I've been here at the COP26 meeting, and a couple of the really important topics that have been discussed with reference to the polar regions has been the melting of the great ice sheets. And we really are quite close to tipping points, I think, and in geological terms. And I think we really need to take a really great notice of what's going on in the polar regions, because it affects the rest of the globe, particularly through sea level. And also there's huge amounts of permafrost in the polar regions, which is thawing and will just release so much methane. So there was quite a lot of incredible discussion at COP about these 2 points particularly. Now, I'm delighted. Before we start our debate, I'm delighted to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Manuel Heitor. He's Portuguese Minister of Science, Technology and Higher Education, and has been involved with Europe and certainly focused on climate change. Dr. Heitor has to leave at 11 o'clock, so if anybody has any questions for him after his talk, please put them in the chat before 11 and we'll pass them over. So, Minister Heitor, over to you.
Thank you so much to you, Dam, and above all to Lidia and Science Europe for organizing this. We all are facing unique challenges across the globe, and COP26 cannot be an excuse to not do more and more. And again, I believe the role of Science Europe is particularly acute in bringing together a number of critical actors, but above all, to remember throughout the world that we need more research. We need certainly the public engagement on research, and I'd like to focus this essentially on three main topics. First is about exactly knowledge. We don't know how to achieve carbon neutrality in the coming 20 years with the existing knowledge. And we can give a number of different examples, but also the experience, and I believe this is an interesting topic of this meeting, the experience of fighting against COVID-19 has clearly shown that fundamental research and fundamental knowledge, when conveniently articulated with innovative, disruptive actions, is the only way to fight a crisis or to fight issues which face our global populations. And again, if we have a vaccine today, is exactly because we were, as a society, either in Europe or the United States, we were able to really articulate the most basic fundamental knowledge with disruptive, particularly innovative actions and projects and entrepreneurial attitudes to make a vaccine and new forms of vaccine happen. So this idea that to face with climate change, we need more knowledge, certainly in areas which do require a better and more deep fundamental understanding, together with the articulation of disruptive activities, projects, and actors, which make this knowledge faster to foster the necessary change. I'm sure that we can give many examples, but let me take three very clear examples. Throughout the world, in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, there has been a pressure towards electric mobility and overall the electrification of our societies, including definitely the electrification of mobility. Definitely, we need that. We know more and more that this will depend on the way we deal with raw materials. Definitely, in the way we can provide sustainable and green mining. Otherwise, it will be unacceptable to look at our own resources. But for doing that, we need really to deep our understanding also of the conversion of those raw materials. For instance, looking at lithium, how can we get lithium oxides? But more and more, then how can we increase the energy density and decrease the volume of batteries, which will depend on critical processes like the atomic deposition of nanoparticles, either lithium or sodium. And we don't know at this current level, we don't have the necessary knowledge how to make these processes, either the full green mining process, but above all, the conversion of raw materials into, in the case of lithium oxides, but above all, the atomic deposition of nanoparticles do require fundamental investment in fundamental material sciences and in the nanosciences. This is an example. Again, other example is about hydrogen. Throughout Europe and again the United States and China, there has been a major movement towards the hydrogen economy, which is a very interesting, clever in terms of climate change to avoid the combustion of carbon. But we don't know yet which will be the secondary effects, for instance, of oxides of nitrogen resulting from the fast burning of hydrogen. And among many other things, we know that by burning hydrogen, we will avoid carbon, but we need a completely different sets of processes to deal with the very fast reactions with essentially timescales which are much, at least 2 orders of magnitude shorter than traditional timescales associated with carbon combustion, and therefore this will result on the need for new materials, but also new sensors and a completely different way to process the security and the safety of our energy systems. And again, these are 2 examples where clearly the transition towards carbon neutrality, which will be our common goal, do require the most basic fundamental knowledge, certainly in a way that can and should be articulated with disruptive entrepreneurial projects. My second observation, and that has been throughout many reports, above all the OECD on the most recent OECD reports on sustainability, is that the need to invest further on knowledge will require a throughout process of institutional innovation. And that has been common, again, the need to better consider interdisciplinary research and innovation, which will require our collective effort to better design the way we arrange our institutions. Certainly, we all know in science that there are no limits to knowledge, but we have been imposing as a society a number of limits to the way our institutions, the way incentives are provided, namely in academic research, but also in a way business at large are verticalized, and therefore the process of institutional innovation that we need to deal with advanced knowledge and a different type of understanding the challenges we face. Last but not least, my third and last point is about not only new knowledge, not only institutional innovation, but further, a third issue which are new observation methods. We certainly today know that the only way to look holistically to the planet is to definitely use high resolution and very high resolution Earth observation systems for low orbit satellites, which do need to evolve, not only in terms of providing the necessary safety of space assets, and this per se is an overall area of emergence of advanced research, particularly in advanced information systems, but also the development of new satellites and new instruments for high and very high resolution image, certainly articulated with in situ sensors, either for climate, ocean, space interactions, but also for other issues from, for example, and a clear example is sustainable land management. For example, and this again is another typical example, we will only achieve the carbon neutrality if we better understand and develop carbon markets, which will require, first and foremost, the measurement of carbon stock, the evolution of carbon stock on our lands in association with climate and atmospheric conditions, which do require considerably sophisticated modeling associated with advanced computing, but certainly based on high resolution image. Again, these are areas of sophisticated technology, but above all, do also require first new knowledge and therefore advanced research, but the training of our population. And therefore, these 3 issues, more knowledge, more institutional innovation, and more and better observation methods, do certainly require the evolution towards a knowledge-based society, essentially a learning society, which will require certainly the upskilling of our overall collective population, but also reskilling and training along life will certainly be critical. That is the reason why I do consider such a critical role Science Europe should play by collectively engage all our funding agencies and main RTOs to call the attention of policymakers, but above all citizens at large. How far do we need to engage everyone in the overall understanding that this is not just a question of a narrative, there is a need to increase the overall investment in R&D. And when we look at Europe, we should be very proud of European achievements over the last 30 or 40 years, particularly over the last 20 years in building up the European research area. But we should also be critical. It was not enough. It was not enough. We know that the overall European investment in R&D is quasi stagnant since the year 2000. Since the Lisbon strategy, we European citizens have not been able to increase the overall investment in R&D, which is stagnant in about 2% of the European GDP. We know that there are notable exceptions, and we know that Germany, among other countries like Belgium and countries like Estonia, have increased their R&D. Portugal is also within that set of countries. But we also know that many other countries, including the United Kingdom, Italy, France, which are associated with large populations, when we compare to the year 2000, they have decreased either the volume of the investment in R&D, but also, and foremost, the intensity of R&D. And coupling with these two variables has become a critical challenge for Europe and the world, but now in the European terms. Further increase the volume of R&D investment. At the same time, we increase the intensity of the R&D investment. The intensity I call the investment per researcher. And these are two critical variables which the last 20 years clearly show us that we have not done enough throughout Europe as a collective society, and therefore there is no time to wait for doing more. And we know that the only way to increase either the volume or the intensity of the R&D and the research and innovation investment is to engage citizens. Hopefully, and we should be very proud to be able to have built a full democratic European context, and therefore should be citizens at large to recognize and to ask the governments elected by themselves to increase the R&D investment. And the question is why in general that has not happened in most of the European regions and countries. And definitely this is also a call for attention to the scientific community. You need to engage people, because without spending time on engaging every single citizen, we will not be able to move. And therefore, this is also, in my view, a responsibility of scientists in general to spend time, certainly in doing more and better research, but also in engaging citizens in all our regions to better understand why we need more science, why we need to articulate science with disruptive and innovative projects and entrepreneurial attitudes in order, definitely, to achieve carbon neutrality in the 20 years to come. Thank you very much, and again, thank you very much, Lidia, for engaging Science Europe in such an important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Heitor. There's a huge number of points that you've raised there, which are incredibly important for carbon neutrality and going forward into the future, addressing climate change. And I hope some of them will come up later in the debate. So thank you very much for that very inspiring discussion point. So now we go on to our panel session. And before we go on to the debate itself, I'd like to introduce our very esteemed panel members that cover a whole range of topics that are relevant to this debate. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Sir Robert Bob Watson. He's former IPCC chair and former chair of the Intergovernmental Platform of Biodiversity, Ecosystems and Services, EPEBS, and many other climate agendas. So over to you, Bob, for your 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. First, let me say that we can no longer consider climate change in isolation with other environmental issues such as loss of biodiversity, degradation of nature, and pollution. They're all interconnected. Also, we can no longer consider these issues to be environmental. They're economic, they're development, security, moral, ethical issues. And therefore, it's absolutely crucial that we have state-of-the-art knowledge to guide this. It's very clear that international assessments such as IPCC and IPBES can play a very vital role in assessing the knowledge for evidence-based decision-making. But they need to be coupled together with national assessments. International assessments can play a role, but we need to understand things at the local level. It's quite clear that with the knowledge we've got, we need to communicate. We need better communication between scientists, governments, the private sector, and the public. It's crucial we all understand what are the implications of our actions, human actions, on the climate system, the loss of biodiversity. What are the implications of those changes in the environment on socio-economic systems, on human health, on nature itself? We need to understand what are the plausible range of solutions and what are the economic and social implications of those options. So the question is, have we learned anything from COVID? Well, we clearly learned very quickly that transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary scientific information was absolutely necessary to address this complex pandemic. But what we also realized was at the very beginning of the pandemic, we didn't use the full range of scientific disciplines in order to inform government of the most logical way to deal with the pandemic. And to be quite honest, the obvious lesson for climate change and other environmental issues such as loss of biodiversity is we need to take into account the full range of disciplines, the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, technologies, and we need to also take into account other knowledge systems, indigenous and local knowledge. It's quite clear that we need consistent messaging between scientists, governments, and the public. So effectively, when we have a pandemic, such as COVID-19, everyone understands what the issues are. Unfortunately, in countries like the US and Brazil and some others, the public were getting contradictory, changing messages from different political parties. And therefore, the public had no clear direction of where to go. And this is happening in the climate situation, certainly in some of the same countries, in Brazil, US, Australia. The public is given totally different messaging from government. They don't know what to do. So we need much more consistent message. We've got to work across political party lines. Also, it's very clear that scientific evidence, however good it is of limited use if governments ignore the information and advice from the scientific community and take short-term, politically expedient decisions rather than looking in the longer term. They often also pre-select their decisions without really considering scientific information. Now, we have to realize there are many factors that go into decision making, not just scientific information. It's quite clearly that many governments in addressing the COVID situation did not take a long-term perspective. They actually took economic considerations over the loss of life and ignored the advice of the scientific community of when to start and end the lockdowns and limit large gatherings and wear masks in public. Many governments were not willing to make the hard decisions it took to address the pandemic. Some did. Australia, New Zealand really took hard-nosed decisions on the lockdowns. Well, what's the situation with climate change? It's very simple. Many governments are still not willing to take the hard decisions that are needed to transition away from a fossil fuel economy and move towards a low carbon economy. They keep making promises. Well, by the mid-century, we'll have net zero. The issue is what we do now, between now and 2030, to address the climate change issue. So again, like COVID-19, many governments are not willing to take those hard decisions that are needed in the near term. They're looking for politically expedient decisions. Now, it's quite clear that while a significant percentage of the public were willing to do the right thing, wear masks, get vaccinated, we have to be quite clear. There was also a significant pushback by some percentage of the public not to wear masks, not to do social distancing. And we're seeing exactly the same thing in the climate change issue. Many are not willing to take the decisions personally that we need, not to waste energy, not to waste water, effectively make the transition we as individuals need to make. Now, we have to recognize the most positive thing that came out of the COVID crisis was indeed the rapid, and I do mean very rapid, development of very effective vaccines. This has been a major plus where the scientific community really did rise to the challenge. Well, the equivalent, of course, in climate change is we know what we need to do. We know that we humans are affecting the climate system, destroying biodiversity, causing pollution. We know those will have adverse effects on today's and future generations. The question effectively is, what have we done on climate? Well, the scientific community has risen to the challenge with a very good understanding of what our actions are doing on climate. We have a good understanding of what the implications of those actions are on human health, on food and water security. We do need to make further advances in the solution space, as we've already just heard from the previous speaker. So basically, there's no shortage of knowledge of what we need to do. There's a shortage of political will, to be quite honest. So the bottom line is quite simple. We have indeed developed the knowledge to address the COVID pandemic and the climate and the biodiversity emergencies, but we need to make sure the public understands these issues so they can support governments and support the private sector to take the necessary actions we need to take to address all of these issues in a cost-effective and socially acceptable manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you for that. We will now move on to our next speaker, which is actually someone who was involved in the COVID epidemic. So Professor Christian Apfelbacher, who's the member of the coordinating group of the German Network of Public Health for COVID-19. Over to you, Christian.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. And in my statement, I would like to follow on from some of the points that have just been made by Bob. Let's remind us first that the climate crisis is also a public health crisis. So with climate change, we'll be expecting more heat waves, we'll be expecting emerging and new infectious diseases affecting countries that have so far not had pandemics or epidemics. We've been dealing with chronic disease for decades, thinking that we have beaten infectious diseases, but they're now coming back, and I think climate change is a major driver of this. So we're expecting more transmissions from animals to humans, and COVID-19 may not be the last pandemic that we're experiencing when we look at the next 20 years. Now, in the public health response to COVID-19 in Germany, it was absolutely inspiring to see how public health scientists got together to actually look at the COVID-19 pandemic in an interdisciplinary manner, from epidemiology through to sociology, psychology, and medicine. Now, the experience we had is that looking at things like a pandemic from an interdisciplinary point of view takes time, because even though we're united under, if you like, the umbrella science, public health, the perspectives are still different. So it did take time to get together and to write policy briefs from an interdisciplinary point of view. Sometimes by the time we had written policy briefs to support decision-making, it was too late. Politicians had to make decisions in a rapid fashion. So one of the issues that is on my mind is how can we produce interdisciplinary policy briefs, background papers that are helpful to decision makers in a rapid way, but yet of high quality. So that was one of the challenges. However, I think there were some fantastic examples of how science provided advice and decision support for politicians, policymakers, and the wider public. But there were also some turning points, and these turning points arose when policymakers and the public realized that there's not one scientific point of view, but there are sort of different opinions. There was this period when we were unsure whether masks would work, and there was this May 2020 WHO statement that then recommended to wear masks. But before that, there was a lot of uncertainty. Now, uncertainty often in policymakers, but also in the public, led to a perspective along the lines of, if science is unsure, why should we follow any advice? Why should we follow any regulations or restrictions? Now, the challenge here is, how can we do better in research and science communication? How can we communicate uncertainty to the public? How can we do better in terms of risk communication? I was doing a workshop with a science journalist last year for early career researchers. And this journalist from Germany said that we're doing fantastic in science. And I think what Bob said about the vaccine development is just magic. It's just so great what we've achieved in terms of vaccine development. But in terms of science communication, sometimes we're more like a developing country. So I think we need to think about how can we empower early career researchers to learn science communication early on. Do we need different grant schemes where science communication and research communication is part of any grant? When I was discussing with colleagues how we could do better in research and science communication, what most people said is, we need to publish our papers, we need to write up the next grant application, we need to supervise our PhD students. So there's no resource often to invest in science communication. Those colleagues who do it almost in their free and extra time. But can we incorporate research and science communication, taking uncertainty into account, better in our funding schemes? Can we institutionalize it better? I think that's an important message. And it also means we need to sometimes leave our academic ivory towers to actually engage with the public. As Dr. Heitor said, we need to engage with not only policymakers, but citizens and the public, explaining the risks associated with vaccines, or rather not associated with vaccination, because the uncertainty that has been created by sort of diverse points of view from science is now something that is confusing the public, and even things that are, there's not much uncertainty around vaccination, but people feel a lot of uncertainty. So there's this huge gap between what we think is certain and sure knowledge and what the public think about it. And one last point I want to make, coming from this public health point of view, is that too often in crisis situations, we do forget that health risks brought about by exposure to a virus, but also the health risks associated with the climate crisis that we will experience, are unequally distributed. So it's very important to understand that not all individuals have the same risks of becoming infected with SARS-CoV-2 or of suffering from the adverse health effects of the climate crisis. So risks are socially unequally distributed, and we must never forget the most vulnerable groups, the people with low education, perhaps migration backgrounds, those people who work at the front, who drive our taxis and so forth. People are differentially at risk. And when we think about, we also often think about effective ways of mitigating crises, of controlling the crisis, and to deal with the adverse effects. But these adverse effects are unequally distributed, and that's an important message I want to close my statement with from a public health point of view. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christian. Really interesting to bring those extra insights in there. Can I just ask everybody who's in the audience that if you have any questions, please could you put them in the Q&A box, and then we'll come back to them later to inform the debate. Let's move on now, and I'd like to introduce Professor Karin Bäckstrand. Karin is Professor of Environmental Social Sciences at the Stockholm University and a member of the Swedish Climate Policy Council. Over to you, Karin.
Thank you for that kind introduction and for all great points by my co-panelists. First, I think it's enormously crucial that we compare these two global existential and intellect threat to society, namely climate change and the COVID pandemic, because they concern crisis management and the interplay of science and policy in issues defined by large uncertainties. And it's interlinked systemic crisis, and I totally agree with Bob on that point, against both human health, ecosystem, animal welfare, and planetary security. Deadly threats, long-term and short-term, and can only be handled by a coherent, multi-level, global, cross-sectoral approach, learning from Agenda 2030 and the 70 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think I want to, in this brief address, first address some commonalities between these, and then between fighting the pandemic and combating climate change, and then move over to lesson learned. Because we now have, with the COVID-19, we have got a fast track of government response during a short time, 6 months, compared with the negotiations on climate change that has been going on for 30 decades. And the first thing, commonality that we really need to, and I come back to that, learn from, is that both are example, both COVID and climate change, of collective action problems at the global level and the national level. So they can never be solved by states unilaterally or going alone, by a multilateral concerted response. And also each country has a collective action problem, because that has to mobilize action and behavioral change among citizens, whether it's to act in accordance with restrictions or to move on to more carbon neutral behavior or climate smart behavior. And then we of course have the problem of free riding of countries and that continue to develop fossil fuels, or groups in countries, as with the pandemic, being anti-vaxxers, oftentimes fueled by toxic national leaders. So no one is safe until everyone is safe. Secondly, I think COVID has showed it was a stress system for the multilateral system, a stress test. We had a lot of corona nationalism and a nationalistic impulse with no coordination initially on vaccine, protection gear, facial mask, border control. Now it's a better coordination. And it was not initially the best moment for the EU, but now we are more on track. And this shows the importance of collaboration across fields. And then we need, of course, to build on transdisciplinary cooperation. Climate change concerns climate modeling, ecology, economics, behavior, and political science, as does corona. So we need this as scientists, cross-disciplinary dialogue, and no turf battles. And we also, but the challenge is, fourthly, on the similarities and differences. Climate change is more of a creeping crisis. While we saw the effects of corona immediately with loss of life, filled ICUs, and therefore what's interesting from corona is that response to it with far-reaching interventions to protect public health and restrict mobility, that was possible, and we need to also take that lessons to corona and to climate change and see how we can change behavior among citizens to limit consumerism, living a low carbon life, because it was done in a very short way during the pandemic. And then, of course, I think that another point is that we now see growing research on climate denialism and corona denialism, and both Christian and Bob mentioned the utmost importance of science education from preschool to higher education, public communication of science, because this denialism of the problem and on the response is a huge challenge. So I'm gonna finish with some quick mutual lessons learned from corona and climate change. First, late action can be very costly and limit future alternatives. Countries that failed in the risk assessment, as Bob said, they jeopardize health of citizens. And now we see runaway climate change, extreme tipping points, cascading crisis. So it's very important to act early and act very firm on both these actions. And secondly, apply the long-standing precautionary principle that we have in many international environmental agreements and public health legislation. We need precaution in the face of radical uncertainty. We need not to use the lack of scientific evidence to postpone action. Thirdly, acceptance and trust and legitimacy among citizens is central to generate this collective behavioral change, because both climate change and corona needs these far-reaching interventions to change citizen behavior. And that is central to secure trust. And then we need to address the distributional consequences and negative effects of both the pandemic and climate change, because unless we address how vulnerable groups are hit by both climate change and pandemic, we will not solve the problem. And I'm going to finalize with the point of the importance of good institutions. Here in COP, we have now the launch of a global network of independent climate policy council, set up to monitor and track government progress toward climate goals. And we have, of course, the UK Climate Change Commission, the Swedish Climate Policy Council that I serve on, and also now a European Scientific Climate Council. And this network of councils are growing. We have now around 20, and it's an enormously important message, because for both climate change and the corona pandemic, we need independent scientific advice to track progress and evaluate governmental action, both how they combat climate change, but also how they handle pandemics, because this is not the last pandemic. So independent scientific advisory board that can provide the best evidence to policymakers on responses to both climate change and the pandemic, it's crucial, and to set that up at the national level. Thank you. I end here, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Karin. Thank you. And finally, we have a short speech by our final panel member, Professor Zbigniew Kundzewicz, Professor of Earth Sciences at the Polish Academy of Science. Over to you, Professor Kundzewicz.
Thank you, Jean. From the point of view of the pandemic management and climate policy, the case of my country, Poland, is not a persuading success story. However, perhaps the case is interesting in that it shows commonalities with other countries. In the year 2020, after the outbreak of the pandemic, two advisory groups covering the COVID and climate change were established by the president of Polish Academy of Sciences. They provided interdisciplinary policy briefs for use by decision makers, media, and the broad public. The advisory group on climate change translated and disseminated the summary for policymakers of the IPCC Working Group 1 sixth assessment report. Yet, the transfer from science to policy is, in my opinion, not satisfactory, and the intake is rather selective. Decision makers take what is convenient and disregard the rest. Poland, as a member country of the European Union, has been formally participating in coining the European Green Deal and the idea of fair transformation. However, common 55% emission reduction target until 2030, accepted by the EU, has raised considerable controversies in Poland. There is no doubt that decarbonization is needed, but the rate of this process, fundamental for mitigation, is being debated. Poland actively works on climate change adaptation. This is certain. Now, the voice of science on climate change and COVID has been heeded by many Poles, but there are also quite numerous skeptics and contrarians in the country, adhering to the conspiracy theory. The effective vaccine is there, and the national vaccination program is functional, providing vaccine to those willing to take it. But only approximately 54% of the eligible population have been fully vaccinated. As regards to climate change, Poland sits on coal, so that anthropogenic climate change is an inconvenient truth. Both corona and climate skeptics thrive on contradictory or seemingly contradictory or changing opinions voiced by scientists, media, and politicians. Health is a common concern for COVID and climate change impacts with weather extremes and heat waves. Today, in Poland, 18,500 new COVID cases and 269 COVID deaths were reported. Therefore, the daily number of COVID-related fatalities is much higher than during the most severe heat waves. There is a difference of scale and urgency. It is necessary to undertake risk assessment and risk reduction at any level of power, from an individual citizen to a school principal, to a CEO of a company, to a minister in a national government. These processes of risk assessment and risk reduction should be informed by scientific evidence. It is attempted to reduce the COVID risk in real time and in short time horizon, like tomorrow. In contrast, the risk of climate change and its adverse impact that is with us already is projected to grow in the day after tomorrow and later, say until 2050 and beyond. Therefore, there is an imperative to undertake effective mitigation actions in order to reduce the risk that would fall on our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we had 4 really good short talks there by the panel members, and I think they've brought out some really critical things, but the common things I think are about scientists needing to talk together internationally and nationally across the disciplines. And then there's about communication to the politicians, and the politicians to understand and willing to take prompt action and precautionary action. And then there's also a really interesting question about citizens, educating the citizens, understanding what risk is, and ensuring that science is trusted and politicians therefore are trusted. So we'll go into the open debate now for about 25 minutes. And if there are any more questions from the audience, please put them in the Q&A box. But I'll start with one question that's come in earlier. So here we go. Some of the more effective COVID-19 responses was in countries which had experience of recent epidemics, i.e. local responses solving a local problem. Given that greenhouse gas emissions are not occurring in the same places as the effects of climate change, what are the lessons for A, effective greenhouse gas emission reduction, and B, effective climate adaptation? So what are the lessons for effective greenhouse gas emission reduction and effective climate adaptation? Neither is being dealt with at COP26 so far. So do I have any volunteers from the panel to answer that question? Any of that? Bob, is this in your area?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, to be quite honest with you. It seems to go where countries have already had local pandemics, did people react better? One thing I noticed was in parts of Eastern Asia, where people often wear face masks, in China, some of the other countries, there was far less resistance to behavioral change in those countries where face masks, China, Japan, Sri Lanka, than there was in sort of countries like the US and Europe, where we were not used to wearing face masks. So if you already are sensitive to issues such as urban air pollution, regional air pollution, and you've already got a response mechanism using masks, it's much easier for the public to respond. I didn't quite get the link to what should we do on adaptation and mitigation. Without understanding the question, it's quite clear we need to both mitigate and to adapt. It's quite clear that we in the North industrial countries have caused the problem. The big issue is effectively, while everyone is affected by climate change, it is typically poor people in poor developing countries that are the most vulnerable. And so our action plan now must be to try to mitigate to less than 2 degrees Celsius, but we should be doing plans now to adapt to a 3-degree world. And that means effectively cooperation between industrialized and developing countries for both mitigation and adaptation. And it's essential that there is both technological help and financial assistance to the most vulnerable countries. And so again, we need collaboration. And again, I don't see we're seeing the level of collaboration we need coming out of COP26.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Karin, over to you.
Yes, I will take a stab at this question. I think I get it, but I don't agree necessarily that, I mean, I think both, and that was my first point, the pandemic and climate change, they are transnational collective action problems. They are spread through, they don't respect boundaries. So the key is we need very strong, both European and global frameworks. Imagine if we didn't have the UNFCCC, the IPCC, the WHO, or the European Public Health Agency. So to fight these effectively, it doesn't work to go it alone. And this, because pandemic with the enormous mobility we have, it traveled across borders. We saw it very clearly how Italy was hit. So mitigation we need, but we also need a global concerted response to adaptation, not only mitigation, and to transfer, of course, technology and funding to least developed countries. And this is also one of my points. We need this because the distributional consequences are terrible of both these collective action problems. And there is no way we can fight these problems effectively unless we address questions of justice, fairness, and allocation of resources.
Indeed. Christian, do you have a response?
Yes, thank you. I think the points that Karin made are quite what I want to get to as well, is that I think the question was hinting at the difference. So whilst we think about commonalities, it's also important to understand the differences, I think, between the pandemic and the climate crisis, is that countries were doing well, or I would even think, like thinking about Germany, Austria, Italy, and so forth, even the regions within countries were doing well because they acted locally, because they, you understand your communities, you know where your nursing homes are, you know how, comparing Eastern Asia and Europe, for example, you know how sensitive people are to data protection. So you may be using digital tracing technologies in Singapore, but you can't use those technologies in Germany because people won't accept them. So it's all about local, like reacting locally, whereas the climate crisis requires that global response. And I think that's what it makes it so difficult, because we were doing well where we acted locally in communities, but bringing together the global community to act together, I think that's the main challenge, and that's what it makes it so difficult.
Indeed. Professor Zbigniew, Kundzewicz.
Thank you. Well, there are two important elements of a climate policy: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is global. So the global sum of greenhouse gas emission counts. Even if one country makes a perfect result, it doesn't help the world if large emitters emit quite a lot. Adaptation, in contrast, is local. So I think this is a very, very important statement. Global sense of mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that one. Yes, indeed. So I'll just move on to another question. It's slightly different. So are there mechanisms of reward and recognition in academia that we need to stop or start to help to foster collaboration, build on research, share and test findings, etc.? Did COVID change anything about these systems which we can learn about for tackling man-made climate change? Karin, is that you?
Yes, I can start on that. I think one of the biggest take-home lessons for academia, and that has been stressed by all speakers, is we need to work across discipline and silos. I'm a political scientist. We need to get together behavioral scientists, both with climate change and the pandemic, behavioral scientists, climate scientists to work together. And I think we need to recognize, however, that is a challenge, because the career path goes still through traditional disciplines. So we need to, yes, learn about each other's methodologies. And as I'm a political scientist focusing on environmental policy, I see how younger scientists are, they cannot really, it doesn't pay off so much to get tenure for working interdisciplinary. So we should change that, and that mode of working, and as I said, avoiding these turf battles between disciplines to fight these collective problems. But I should end on a positive note for the whole, we were discussing the education system, that I see among students today much more a demand of having climate and environmental science in their education, a a much more increasing demand that we need to address these collective challenges throughout the education system in a non-siloed way.
Mm-hmm. Bob, would you like to respond?
Yes, it's quite clear that in some areas we've made excellent progress. So, for example, in the two big international assessments we've mentioned here today, IPCC and ITBES, they really do have a superb cross-section of the disciplines: natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, more and more, especially on ITBES, indigenous and local knowledge. They really are truly multidisciplinary. However, if you analyze in a number of countries, and I'm not an expert here, the funding mechanisms are still often very disciplinary, not transdisciplinary. The journals are typically disciplinary, not transdisciplinary, and university departments are still disciplinary. Now, we are making progress on funding journals and university departments, but I think we do have to go further, to be quite honest. So we've got assessments, very multidisciplinary, but also when young scientists work on IPCC, are they rewarded? Is their work rewarded for working on an assessment, rewarded in the same way and recognized by the university as a journal article? So there are some barriers and challenges that we still have to overcome. I think we're moving in the right direction, but we can do better without any question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thanks, Bob. There's a question here. Actually, I'm going to join two questions. One is about, is academia easy enough for policymakers to navigate, to find the evidence and expertise they need to help them make policy decisions? That's for policymakers looking into academia. But there's also a question here about climate denial and whether scientists should focus on countering existing disinformation, which questions the basics of climate change, which is essentially about communication again, versus communicating new findings and solutions that assume an acceptance of the existence of climate change. So it's about communication. I think communication to public and climate deniers and how we should go about it, or about how we communicate better to policymakers. Christian, is that one that you could handle?
Yes, happy to. So is academia easy to navigate for policymakers? I would think no. I know it's not easy to navigate. I think it's difficult to navigate. And what I mentioned in my statement is one thing is that disciplines look at one phenomenon from different points of view, and that creates even different sorts of forms of knowledge. So evidence is only one form of knowledge. That's important. We had a lot of ethical issues in the COVID-19 pandemic that you cannot answer on empirical grounds. So there are different forms of knowledge, and what we need is this, what Bob alluded to, and Karin is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary way of looking at things. But that's not done just like that. When we founded the Competence Network Public Health, we realized that even biostatistics, epidemiology, and sociology have their distinct points of view, even though they're united under public health. So there's this kind of, it needs an extra effort to speak that common language. That's one point between sciences. And then we need much more, I think, knowledge broking. We need then good ways to produce policy briefs. You know, there's not a science of how do you do good policy briefs. Do they need to be 3 pages? Do they do they need to be lay language? We don't know the needs of the policy. We need to do research with policymakers. What are their needs? What is a way that we can generate the information so that the information can be digested by policymakers in an easy and effective way? And then the second point alluded to the problem of denial, misinformation, fake news. I've reached out to communication scientists last year when there was so much misinformation, particularly I think from the United States but also in Europe. I think it was everywhere. And what I learned is that it's best to look at this as an epidemic of misinformation, fake news. So we don't only have a COVID-19 pandemic, we also have an epidemic of misinformation. And communication scientists have powerful tools that we can use, such as correcting information in social media. But I think we didn't, by far, we didn't do enough to look at opportunities, to look at tools and how we can deal as a society with this epidemic of misinformation. So that's a research stream in its own right that we need to invest more funding into, I think.
Thank you. Professor Kundzewicz.
Thank you. I feel that scientists should treat rectification of fake news and disinformation as a priority. This is a very important job for us. And we should talk rather than deliver monologues. If there is a talk, if there is an exchange of arguments, the result could be constructive. But unfortunately, we have silos of people who do not contact with each other, live in their closed world, and know better, besserwisser. They know better, and they don't accept anything from beyond. So again, very important issue for scientists. Thanks.
Thank you, Karin.
Thanks for very good question and an excellent response. And I just want to add one thing on the famous science policy gap and then on denialism. I think we need to acknowledge that decision makers, A, they hate uncertainty, and B, they hate complexity and also have a numerous consideration to take into account when taking decision, not only science, but citizen support. They have to weigh this. And on the first thing with uncertainty, I agree with, I think it was Christian who said, we need, as scientists, as political scientists, we call them knowledge brokers, epistemic communities that translate and frame complex scientific findings into a narrative that policymakers can understand. Because long time ago, when I interviewed for my PhD for the transboundary air pollution negotiations experts, they said, if you have 100 uncertainties, and we all know there are hundreds of uncertainties, don't stress them all to the negotiations decision makers. It will paralyze. So that's an important point. And then I think on climate denialism and corona denialism, it's coming out a lot of research. It has the same dynamic. What we also need to address, and that's a larger political issue, is that this is very much linked to populism, because populism has the core feature of populism is that there is a simple answer to complex problems. And we know it's not, we as scientists. And this is a very tempting trope for leaders. We see around the world, I hope there is a peak in populism, but with Brazil, in the US, Trump, nationalist, populist, authoritarian leaders that foster at the highest level, even in democratic countries, anti-science narratives, and to speak to constituencies, and that's very toxic. But populism, we could have a panel on this. I think this is a challenge that we as science and citizens need to systematically address, and also the fear among citizens. We need to recognize that they are losers of globalization, that there will not be a just transition, that they will lose jobs in the fossil industry. We need to address those concerns also, because they are legitimate concerns.
Indeed. It's such a complex topic. Even the science itself is very complex. The minister mentioned about batteries and lithium and all that kind of thing, which is, going to be mined from the seafloor. But I went to talks this week where we talked about how the seafloor is actually a natural place where carbon is buried. So if we start disturbing the seafloor, we start disturbing natural carbon burial processes. So it's a very complex subject. Bob, I'll come to you, but there is, in the Q&A, there's a specific question for you which actually links to this. It's about something you said about waiting to 2030, but it's actually about, if you go into, it's a more practical level. If you go into a supermarket and you look at what's on the shelves of a supermarket, you can see things that damage the environment. You can see plastic, environmental contamination. And the question really is about the public is thirsty for guidance, and so how should the public react? But can academics speak directly to the public more easily?
Okay, let me touch on the other thing first. I think I liked all of the answers I heard. What's crucial is to make sure we as scientists both produce the knowledge needed by decision makers, not just governments, but also the private sector and the public. So we need to have transdisciplinary science where we're all involved in co-design and co-production. Absolutely crucial that the scientists don't believe that they know all the questions are. We need to continuously work with decision makers in government, the private sector and the public to make sure our science is relevant and answering questions that everybody has. One of the concerns is very few politicians in the US and the UK, I can't speak to Germany and other, they're not scientists. They're really scared of science. They've got no scientific background whatsoever. They're nearly either lawyers or they're businessmen, or women, of course. And so one of the challenges we have on these complex scientific issues is we're talking to intelligent individuals, but really actually have no real scientific training to know how to look at risk and how to look at uncertainty, basically. So that is indeed a challenge that we have, basically. We as scientists should, wherever possible, directly interact with the public if we can. I think we should all do more public speaking engagements on a whole range of issues, whether it's on plastic wrapping, whether it's on climate change. I've done a few in the last few weeks. It's a youth. As part of the Norwich Science Festival, which were youth. I gave a talk to youth in Mexico who are suing the Mexican government, and their case is actually being heard by the Supreme Court. So I think the more we reach out to people, especially the youth of the world, arm them with the information they need to make their own decisions in their personal life, but also when they vote, for politicians that care about these issues, use their purchasing power to make sure that the private sector knows we want our goods and services produced sustainably. So I think, yes, we can do a lot more of working with public. And one of the problems with the big documents I've been associated with, IPCC, IPBES, Making Peace with Nature, is they're not written for the everyday person in the street, which is how can we take these very, very good documents and actually turn them into something that actually can be taught in the schools, or the average person in the public can read them. So we need to somehow take our knowledge, not dumb it down, but put it into more everyday language so people can get excited by it. Why should they care about these issues? So I think there's a lot we can do on the communications front. Because we as scientists quite often aren't the best communicators to the lay person in the street.
Thank you. Professor Kundzewicz.
No, sorry.
Oh, okay, thank you. There was a question earlier on that went to the minister, but he's left. But I think it was a good question. It's about one of the reasons why we managed to move so fast on COVID was that there was funding made available very quickly, and a lot of it. And I think the question was, can we do that again? Do you think we should do that again for climate change? Can we do that again for climate change? The answer is obviously yes, but is there how do, I mean, it's such a big question. There is a big problem. Bob, you had your hand up first, I think.
Yeah, there's plenty of money available. If you look around the world today, there are huge distortionary subsidies for energy, for agriculture, for mining, transportation. In both energy and agriculture, there are direct subsidies that lead to unsustainable practices of about $700 billion per year in both agriculture and energy. There's also indirect subsidies where we don't internalize the price of pollution. IMF have estimated it's $5 trillion a year in energy because we don't price the externalities. So if we could take these subsidies in energy, in mining, in agriculture, away from unsustainable practices like fossil fuel subsidies and put them into low carbon, also putting them into sustainable agriculture, we could go a long, long way. So the climate fund is meant to be $100 billion a year. Biodiversity fund, $100 billion a year. If we could just get rid of these 1 to 2 trillion direct subsidies, let alone the indirect subsidies, there is money out there. It's the way we're spending it.
Mm-hmm. Karin.
I agree totally on that point. And I want to add this, that we should use the pandemic as a window of opportunity for accelerating the green recovery and really use that as a momentum to do long-term investment in carbon decarbonization. And because the world has never seen, or it's unprecedented, the size of not only the European, but the national, also not only EU's Corona package recovery and saving. There were massive amounts gathered at very short time. And what we now see, and this is the good thing with the Green Deal and the budgets, is that their 30% of the funding should be devoted to climate investment and clean energy. But this is in Europe, and we see that the leading European countries like France and Germany, they have 30 to 40% of the pandemic to invest. So you can use the pandemic recovery to support climate transition. But it's very worrisome, as Bob says, that there is a risk of being a carbon lock-in, that we continue to subsidize fossil fuel, invest in fossil fuel industry to save jobs. So this is a critical juncture, but I hope the European Green Deal shows the way forward to link fiscal policy, climate and health policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Karin. We're running out of time, and we need to go to Lidia for a summary, but so thank you for the other questions that have been submitted. There's one last one, though, I'd like to finish with. Maybe we could have some quick answers, and it's to turn the question of this session around. What can we learn regarding the COVID-19 response to climate change? What can we learn regarding the COVID-19 response from the response to climate change? In other words, are there areas where the climate change response has been more successful or effective than that towards COVID-19? There's a challenge. So have we done better in climate change response than we did in COVID-19 response?
No.
Bob, did you?
Yeah, the answer is I think we have not done very well at all in either. The climate change issue has been around as a political issue since the Earth Summit in 1992. We have fundamentally wasted 30 years in trying to deal with climate change. If we'd have started to mitigate even soon after the Climate Change Convention was signed and then ratified in 1992, 1994, we wouldn't be looking at rates of decarbonisation today. Equally on COVID, I really don't think we handled it very well in many countries of the world. Some, I think, like New Zealand and Australia did. The US has been terrible. The UK has got some of the worst mortality rates in the world, even though they have a science group called SAGE advising governments. We've got to learn from both of them. We've got to stand back and say, at the national level, why have we not done well on both? And at the international level, because as everyone here has said, you need coordinated action on a pandemic. You need a coordinated action on climate change. I think we really have to understand why we've done so poorly on both. And it's short-term vested interest over long-term in many respects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we could have responded a lot earlier. Karin.
I'm going to be a bit more positive and see the half full. I think actually we have, or if we look on the concerted global multilateral response, what we did better, we have done better in climate change, and that the pandemic response need to learn for, is the importance of building up an international architecture of, we have the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and mechanism. I totally agree that that is not sufficient, but I tell my students, imagine if we didn't have that framework of multilateral,
sure,
that we don't have, that we will begin, we need to build that in COVID and for the next pandemic, to WHO, but much more stronger international collaborative response. So I think here, because what was a very dangerous thing is Corona nationalism, that each country divides according to its, and works for those countries with populist authoritarian leaders that kind of go it alone strategy. So yes, I think we did better on that note in climate change, and we can learn to do it for the next horrible pandemic that hopefully will not hit us.
Thank you. Christian.
So I know we're short of time, so I just want to re-emphasize what Karin said. I fully agree. Looking at climate change from a public health perspective, there's no COVID summit, there's WHO, but it needs to be stronger, and we've completely forgotten the low-income countries in COVID.
Yep, thank you very much for that. So we're just going to finish off. Thank you very much to all the panelists and for all the questions that were brought in. That was a really interesting debate. Lidia has tried to summarize what we've been discussing and all your comments. So over to you, Lidia, to finish the debate. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Jane. Yes, and as you very rightly say, I'm trying to summarize what it has changed, what has been said, because this dialogue has been so rich and so profound based on the experience and background of the speakers that is virtually impossible to summarize it in 5 minutes. But anyway, what I will do is I will highlight a quote from every single speaker, and then I will leave you my list of 8 major points that I capture across all this discussion. So from Minister Heitor, he said many right messages. I retain his plea for engaging citizens and to better understand the challenge of the climate change, to both to advocate for more investment in research, but also to take the necessary measures themselves. From Karin, I retain that fantastic quote, no one is safe until everybody is safe. Or there are no simple answers to complex problems. Thank you, Karin. From Bob, I remain this absolute must of providing consistent messages from the research, from the scientific sector, even if they are too uncomfortable and to cut across different political lines. I think this was a very, very important point. Christian, in a similar line, made a strong point on communication and said that the scientific world needs to do much better at not only at communicating science, but also at communicating the uncertainty that surrounds the activity in science, and be honest about it and be just natural about it. Last but not least, I retain from Zbigniew this absolute truth as well, as he says, that the anthropogenic climate change is an uncomfortable truth, especially for politicians. But we need to get around that. And I loved his proposed solution. The scientific community should talk and not provide monologues. I think this is an excellent way to move around this kind of constraint system. Then here is my list of 8 bullet points I took. First of all, very important, we are facing a human challenge as we've never seen before. The dimensions surpass all of us greatly, and this has been inconceivable for us until now, and we are becoming more conscious, and we need to ensure that we are all together. Second bullet point, citizen role, super important in realizing the challenge, advocating for the needs of social adjustments, research adjustments, political adjustments, and be able to demand that from politicians. Third bullet point, we spent a lot of time talking about the science policy and politics interface and the role of science as a knowledge broker, ready to provide rapid briefings, high quality briefings for rapid decisions. That's what our politicians need. Fourth point, the role of science in kind of capital letters. All disciplines have to be on board. Engineering, fundamental physics, chemistry, social sciences and humanities, economy, all disciplines have to be on board. Fifth point, big point on communication, fighting fake news, denial, upgrading and upscaling the training of students, researchers, and the public at large is much, much needed. Sixth point, partnerships in science. We need more science in partnership with policymakers, 2 partnerships, building a circle, not just unidirectional. And another partnership that we have not touched much, but Minister Heitor did, science with technology, solutions that industry can provide next to science to come up with appropriate local solutions and not just global solutions, so local solutions. Seventh point, institutional reforms. Several of you touched upon this point, saying that currently the research organizations are perhaps not best structured to meet the challenge, to enable more interdisciplinary research and to assess it appropriately. So here is a call for the institutions. And last point, last but not least, is the voice of research. This need to act coherently, honestly, for ourselves and for the population, for the citizenship at large. So here is my short take-up of this excellent conversation. Just to say that we are going to produce for sure 1 piece of news, but probably more, because I see that this dialogue has been extremely fruitful and deserves a very good report out of it. But you can expect some news in the coming days published in some relevant journals, and we will of course keep you up to date on all this communication. So we will start by applying the lessons to ourselves. So we will start by communicating as better as possible the results of this dialogue. So thank you very much all for your excellent contributions, and to the audience for their participation and questions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.